Hello! You will hear the most beautiful and strangest things at the same time. Don't ask me how, but get your drink now. Enjoy the story. On your way, like and subscribe. Let's begin. High in the mountains, where the only sound was the whistle of the wind hitting the bare rocks, Jor lived with his wife in a small, crumbling hut. The house resembled a shadow of a home, with a holey roof and cracked walls, and the cold seeped inside like a heavy, never-ending guest. Jor was a man in his mid-30s, thin-bodied, pale-faced, his bones protruding beneath his skin. This wasn't due to illness, but rather to the prolonged hunger that had become so accustomed to his body that it had become a part of him. His wife fared no better. She sat most of the time by the cold stove, staring into the ashes as if searching for a glimmer of hope. Their day began in complete silence, as if the mountains themselves were silently watching them. No rooster crowed, no dogs barked, no people passed by the hut. Only the wind, and occasionally the rustle of dry branches as wild animals passed by in the distance. Jor would wake up at dawn, drag himself outside, and stand on the small hill in front of his house to contemplate the valley. His face was rigid, his eyes sunken, as if he were asking the mountains themselves, how long? Hunger was his worst enemy. One day they would eat a dry piece of bread. The next they would go without food from morning until night. Even water had to be brought from a distant spring, a spring that froze for half the year. Despite it all, Jor refused to give up. He would go into the forest every day to collect firewood and sell it in the distant village. Sometimes he would return with 2 or 3 dirhams, and other times he would return empty-handed, trailing behind him heavy footsteps and a disappointment deeper than the night itself. On the way, he would think of his wife waiting for him sitting in the hut, and of her eyes that had long since lost their sparkle. At night, when darkness fell over the mountains, the silence grew heavier. The only sound was their breathing as they hid under old blankets in a desperate attempt to ward off the cold. His wife would sometimes break the silence by saying, "One day we'll leave this place, Jor. We can't starve here." Jor would pause for a long time before answering her with a faint smile and short words, even though deep down he knew there was no way out. Everything was closed in his face. But on that particular night, as the rain leaked through the roof and dripped onto their faces, Jor felt something different. Perhaps it was a sense of rebellion, or perhaps absolute despair that made him willing to do anything. He sat for a long time in the dark, his eyes staring at the nearly extinguished fire, until he said to himself, "Tomorrow I won't be like this anymore." He had heard of a weekly market held in a village a little further away, where people sold used goods and old motorcycles. At that moment, for the first time in months, he felt he had a plan. He decided to go there, to find a motorcycle, and convert it into a business vehicle, transporting people and goods across rough terrain, and sharing the profits with the motorcycle owner. He didn't know that this small decision would change his entire life, and that the mountain paths he knew so well would take him to a world he'd never seen before, a world not inhabited only by humans. As the sun rose that day, Jor picked up his old motorcycle, wiped off the night's dust, and set off for the weekly market at the foot of the mountain. The air was cold, but he didn't care. All he cared about was finding at least one customer, someone who would pay him enough to return to his wife with some bread and maybe a little oil. He sat all day at the entrance to the market, the motorcycle parked beside him, waiting. The hours passed slowly, heavily, as the sun rose and then sank toward sunset. He looked at the passers-by, hoping someone would turn and ask for a ride, but no one came near. Morning passed, followed by noon, then afternoon, and even as night fell, the place remained as quiet as a graveyard. Darkness fell, the merchants closed their shops, and the last of the visitors left. Silence fell over the market, and only Jor remained, sitting on a stone near his motorcycle, staring blankly at the ground. He felt deeply disappointed, as if all his hopes were melting in the cold night. He looked at the watch on his wrist. It was exactly midnight. He sighed, then slowly stood up, deciding to return to his hut, to his wife who was waiting for him. He felt his day had been wasted. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he heard slow footsteps approaching behind him. He turned quickly and saw an elderly man standing a few meters away. He was tall, slightly hunched, wearing a dark coat that reached his knees and a hat that hid half of his face. His voice was calm but deep as he said, "Can you take me to a village, my son?" Jor was confused for a moment, then felt something resembling hope radiate from his chest for the first time since morning. He smiled a small smile and said hesitantly, "Yes, no problem. Where do you want to go?" The man raised his head slightly, the moonlight reflecting on his pale face as he answered, "I want you to take me to a distant village, 100 kilometers from here." Jor's eyes widened in surprise. 100 kilometers? The road was dangerous, dark, and bumpy, and he wouldn't arrive before dawn. He shook his head and said hesitantly, "It's too far. I can't. Excuse me." But the old man didn't back down. Instead, he smiled calmly and said, "If you take me there, I'll pay you a fare multiplied by 100. 100 times the usual amount." At that moment, Jor's heart felt as if it stopped for a few seconds. The amount the man had mentioned was enough to buy a small van, rent a house in the city, and completely change his life. He felt a fever coursing through his veins. Maybe this was my only chance of salvation. He turned to his bike, then to the man, and after a short silence said, "Okay, I'll take you." The old man smiled broadly, a smile that seemed strangely sincere, and said in a calm voice, "You have a kind heart. You will perform miracles with that heart one day." Jor paused for a moment, then smiled wryly as he started the bike's engine. "What's this guy like?" he thought. "Does he think I'm an angel? I'm just looking for money, a better life." The man climbed in behind him and gently pulled his shoulders, sending a chill running down Jor's spine. Together, they set off down the dark mountain road, the bike rumbling through the silence with the sound of its engine. The night was deep, the wind howled, and the mountains stood on either side like giant black shadows silently watching their passage. The further they got from the market, the more a strange feeling crept into Jor's chest. He wasn't sure whether to feel fear or excitement. All he knew was that he'd set himself on an extraordinary journey, one that would take him to a place he never imagined he'd reach. Jor was still standing in the middle of the house, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with panic. The silence that had settled over the place was suffocating, pressing against his chest until he felt the air disappear from the room. He tried to convince himself that what he had just seen was merely an illusion brought on by fatigue, but his heart was beating at a frightening rate, telling him that what was happening was real. As he tried to comprehend the situation, he noticed a small door, half hidden behind an old piece of wood in the corner of the room. It resembled a basement door, covered in dust as if it hadn't been opened in years. Something inside him urged him closer, as if his survival instincts compelled him to investigate what lay beyond. He slowly reached out and unlocked the rusty lock, which made a sharp creak that pierced the stillness of the night. Jor descended the basement stairs with extreme caution, each step making a muffled sound that echoed among the stone walls. The further he descended, the more intense the smell of dampness and mold became, until he felt the air weighing heavily on his chest. When he reached the bottom of the cellar, he froze, unable to believe what he saw. There, in the dim darkness pierced by a faint ray of light from a small window, lay the elderly man he had disappeared with on the way, bedless and pillowless, like a corpse left to rot. Right next to him lay the man who had welcomed him into the house, asleep or unconscious, in the same manner, without any covering or comfort. A sharp shiver ran through Gor's body, and he felt his feet frozen to the ground. For long seconds, he was unable to move forward or backward, until his survival instincts overcame his mind, and he realized he had to flee immediately before he found himself in a worse situation. He turned very slowly, holding his breath so as not to make a sound, and tremblingly climbed the stairs, every muscle in his body screaming with panic. As soon as he emerged from the basement, he rushed to the door, opened it violently, and grabbed his bike without hesitation. He didn't think, didn't try to understand, just wanted to get away from this cursed place as quickly as possible. He mounted his bike and set off down the dark road, driving frantically, as if everything behind him was chasing him. But the horror didn't end there. Minutes later, he lost control of the bike, swerving off the road and crashing into a huge tree trunk. Gor fell to the ground, hitting his head hard. The pain was intense, and blood began to flow from his forehead. His bike was completely destroyed, and he could no longer use it. He felt his consciousness slowly fading, but before he completely lost consciousness, he glimpsed a scene that made him tremble even more than the pain itself. He saw the old man standing a few meters away, and beside him was the other man who had welcomed him into the house. They were both walking slowly toward him, their faces expressionless, as if they had emerged from a vivid nightmare. Gor could do nothing. He lost consciousness completely, lying on the cold ground as the night grew darker and more eerily silent. It was 5 in the morning when Jor entered the village. He was exhausted beyond belief, his hand barely able to hold the handlebars, and his eyes half closed from staying up late. He stopped in the middle of the small village square and turned off the motorcycle. He turned back and said hoarsely, "We've arrived." But as soon as he finished, his heart sank. The back seat was empty. There was no one there. His eyes widened as he looked left and right, searching for the old man. All he saw was the thick morning mist and the trees surrounding the place like silent walls. He jumped off the motorcycle and frantically searched around, shouting, "Sir, where are you?" No one responded. All he could hear was his own voice echoing through the trees. He ran a little between the nearby huts, searching in the shadows, even behind the small trees, but there was no sign of the man. It was impossible to get off the motorcycle without being noticed. Jor was sure of that. He froze, a cold sweat dripping from his forehead despite the chill of dawn. It wasn't just the money he'd lost, but something else. Something bigger and deeper. His mind refused to believe what was happening. He sat on a stone near the road, trying to catch his breath, but his thirst was growing. His throat was as dry as the desert. He stood up, shuffling toward the first house in the village. It was still dark, and the roosters hadn't yet begun to crow. He approached the door of a small house and knocked lightly. Seconds passed before the door slowly opened, revealing a man in his late 30s, dressed in pajamas and with half-sleepy eyes. He looked at Jor in surprise and said in a low voice, "What do you want, man?" Jor answered in a tired voice, "I'd like a glass of water, please. I've been on the road all night." The man studied his haggard features for a moment, then opened the door further and said, "Come in. I'll bring you water, and if you want to stay here for the rest of the night, that's fine." Jor froze for a moment, then nodded gratefully and entered. The house was small and quiet. Its owner lit a lantern and placed it on the wooden table. He motioned for Jor to sit down, then said, "Wait here a little while. But tell me, what brings you to the village at this time?" Jor sat down on the chair and began to tell his story. He poured out everything he had on his mind: his poverty, his long day at the market, the strange man who had appeared in the middle of the night, the 5-hour journey, and his sudden disappearance upon arriving at the village. He spoke quickly, as if trying to relieve a weight that had weighed heavily on his chest all night. The man listened silently, occasionally shaking his head. When Jor finished, he said quietly, "I think hunger has worn you down, man. Perhaps everything I saw was an illusion due to exhaustion." Jor felt a pang in his stomach and quickly replied, "Yes, perhaps, but I'm really hungry. If you'll allow me some food before water." The man smiled and said, "Okay, I'll give you what you need." The man stood up, but instead of heading to the kitchen, he headed toward the bathroom door in the corner of the house. He opened it, entered, and closed it behind him. Jor sat waiting, thinking he'd be out in a moment. Minutes passed, then a quarter of an hour, then a full half-hour. Anxiety began to creep into his heart. He got up, approached the bathroom door, and knocked lightly. "Are you okay?" No answer. He knocked again, this time more forcefully. There was an eerie silence. He heard no movement, no sound of running water, no footsteps. He hesitated a moment, then put his hand on the doorknob and pushed it slowly. The bathroom was empty. Jor took a step back, as if struck by lightning. His heart pounded so hard he felt he might fall to the ground. Where had the man gone? There was no window to escape through, no other door. He disappeared as if he had never been. He began scanning the house in panic, opening the doors one by one, calling out in a trembling voice, "Hey man, where are you?" But the house remained silent. It was as if everything in it had died. Even the whir of the lantern suddenly died away. Jor felt completely alone in the house, so alone that his own voice became unfamiliar. He sat on the floor, staring at the empty toilet, his eyes wide with terror. He no longer knew whether what he had experienced that night was real or a nightmare from which he had yet to awaken. Jor woke up from his coma in the hospital, his eyes adjusting to the dim daylight. His whole body ached, but the most noticeable thing he noticed was the sound of crying all around him. He turned around slowly and found his wife, who had been feeling anxious all day, sitting beside him, crying bitterly. Her tears streamed uncontrollably, hugging him tightly as if she feared losing him again. His wife jumped on him and hugged him tightly, her tears flowing like a waterfall. Jor sat in amazement, trying to comprehend what had happened and how he had ended up at the hospital. "How did you get me here?" he asked her in surprise. She replied, between sighs and tears, "Oh, Jor, you can't believe what happened. I was alone in the hut, worried and scared, and the mountains around me were silent and desolate. Suddenly, an elderly man knocked on the door, accompanied by another man who appeared to be his son. They were carrying a large bag full of money and many things that would last us for a whole month. We had nothing, so they came carrying all of this, despite the weight of the bag, and placed it in the hut. They told me that you were injured now, and that they would take you to the hospital for treatment." Jor smiled faintly despite the pain, then stood up with difficulty, his eyes still stunned. He felt something strange that brought him closer to reality. How could two people come with such force and speed, especially in those circumstances? Jor grabbed his wife's arm, and together they walked out to the reception. He approached the receptionist and asked her hesitantly, "Who brought me here?" The clerk smiled and said, "It's an old man and his son. You can see them if you like, and they've fully paid for your treatment." Gore was shocked again, having never expected to have his entire debt paid in such a mysterious way. He left the hospital with his wife, his heart aching with astonishment. She went to the bike owner's house, only to discover that the wrecked bike had been replaced with a brand new one, clean and as if nothing had happened. Gore asked in surprise, "What?" The bike owner smiled and said, "An old man and his son gave it back to you. Everything is new and ready to go right away." Gore's heart leapt with both confusion and joy. His wife took a small letter from her pocket and handed it to him. He opened the letter with a trembling hand and read the words written in mysterious ink. "Say thanks to God." Gore froze for a moment, then a broad smile spread across his face. He suddenly understood the truth. These were not ordinary people. The old man and his son were two peaceful demons who wanted to help him and bless his life and that of his family. Tears of joy streamed down his cheeks, and he silently thanked them. He felt that life had given him a new chance, a life of security and comfort after all his suffering. A few days later, Jor was able to buy a house and a taxi in the city, and began a new life with his wife and children. They lived happily, their days filled with joy and peace, all thanks to the two peaceful demons who chose him to change his fate for the better. And so, after years of hunger and suffering, Jor found his family, and fear and poverty no longer threatened his life. And so ended Gore's story with the two peaceful demons and the dark mountains. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss a new horror story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.